Hello and welcome to part 3 of a 3-part video series on the historical Pontius Pilate. If you are joining me for the first time, you should know that part 1, the first video, was all about Pontius Pilate through the eyes of the biblical authors. Part 2, or the second video, was all about the non-biblical sources for Pontius Pilate. And part 3, the video you're watching right now, is about taking the biblical and non-biblical sources and putting them together to see what kind of a picture we can get of the historical Pontius Pilate. So that's how I'll start, but I thought it would be fun to end this video by talking about what the early Christians thought of Pontius Pilate, and how he actually turned out to be a pretty controversial figure within early Christianity. Was Pilate really an innocent man and an eventual Christian convert, or was he guilty of murdering Jesus, and did that shame and guilt cause him to eventually commit suicide? Well, it depends on what ancient source you read. But more on that in just a minute. For now, I'd like to take the biblical sources of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts, and the book of 1 Timothy, and combine it with the non-biblical sources of Josephus, Philo, Tacitus, the Pilate Stone, and even some minted coins to see what kind of a picture we can create of Pontius Pilate. And actually, I'll include the information about Pilate's name and the information about ancient Roman prefects to get a full picture of who Pontius Pilate was. With all of that info out of the way, here's what we know about the historical Pontius Pilate. Many historians would say that Pilate would have been born around 12 BCE, making him around the age of 38 when he became the prefect of Judea in the year 26 CE. Pilate governed for a little over 10 years, from 26 to 36 CE, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. During Pilate's governorship, there are a few crucial moments that will define him for the rest of human history. He was a bold man, steeped in the ways of traditional religious practices of ancient Rome, and he clearly wanted Jerusalem and all of Judea to embrace the imperial cult by worshiping the emperor as a deity. This did not sit well with the Jewish communities that he governed, which often brought him into conflict with them. Despite these conflicts, Pilate was likely friends with Caiaphas, the high priest, and well acquainted with the affairs of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which, at the time, likely sympathized more with the Sadducees than with the Pharisees. Pilate lived in Caesarea Maritima, traveling to Jerusalem to engage in judicial matters, both Jewish and Roman. He also likely traveled to Jerusalem 3 times a year to oversee the Jewish pilgrimage festivals, which required every able-bodied Jewish man to travel to Jerusalem to sacrifice at the temple. These 3 Jewish festivals were Pesach, also known as Passover, Shavuot, also known as the Festival of Weeks, and Sukkot, also known as the Festival of Booths, or Tabernacles. It would make sense that Pontius Pilate would be in Jerusalem for the Passover. There would be a ton of pilgrims coming into Jerusalem to sacrifice at the temple, and he would be there to keep the peace and be the first line of defense if there was a revolt or riot that would break out. Pilate did have the authority to administer the death penalty, which at the time would have been death by Roman crucifixion. He is famous for presiding over the trial of Jesus of Nazareth, who was turned over by the Jewish high priests and leaders for sedition, for claiming to be a king. Which is why in all 4 Gospels, Pilate asks Jesus if he is the king of the Jews. According to our Christian writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, Pilate believed Jesus was innocent, but was pressured into condemning Jesus to death because of the Jewish leaders and his fear of an uprising. Historically, both of these things would make logical sense for Pontius Pilate. Pilate was in cahoots with the Jewish chief priests and elders, so politically wanted to please them, and it was during the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, which would have been an opportune time for the Jews to cause an uprising. So Pilate's fear is justified. Pilate condemned Jesus to death, even though he perhaps thought Jesus was innocent. Although some scholars wonder just how innocent Pontius Pilate really was, especially to the earliest Christians. Did the gospel writers make Pilate look even better to not face more Roman persecution, or were they truly giving historical facts about Pontius Pilate? On that, I'll let you be the judge. Pilate continued to govern in Judea under the authority of Tiberius. Roman prefects are usually subordinate to the legate of Syria, but for the first 6 years in which Pilate held office, Syria's legate, Lucius Aelius Lamia, was absent from the region, giving Pilate the ability to govern as he saw fit. But in 35 CE, Lucius Vitalis was appointed legate of Syria, which would have likely caused Pilate to govern with more caution and fear. Pilate was eventually called back to Rome to speak with Emperor Tiberius at the command of Lucius Vitalis, but when Pilate returned to Rome, Tiberius was already dead. We don't know anything else about Pontius Pilate's life after this point in time. When he went back to Rome, many scholars believe he died shortly thereafter. During Pontius Pilate's life, at least according to Matthew and other Christian traditions, Pontius Pilate was married and had a wife. In the Gospel of Nicodemus, it tells us what Pontius Pilate's wife's name was. It was Procula in Latin, or Procla in Greek. The Gospel of Nicodemus, however, wasn't written until the 5th century, and so we have to look at this with some level of skepticism. In the writings of St. Jerome, Pontius Pilate's wife's name is Claudia Procula, although this is also an early 4th or early 5th century writing. Pilate was likely born into an equestrian Roman family, as many with Samnite ancestors were. Because of this, we can deduce that he was likely well-educated, somewhat wealthy, and regularly involved politically and highly esteemed socially. We don't know for sure if he was part of the Roman military, but the name Pilate could mean skilled with the javelin, and therefore could imply that he, or at least his father, was part of the Roman military. He certainly had the authority to condemn individuals to death via Roman crucifixion, and according to Josephus and Philo, he exercised this right against innocent people from time to time. We get two very different pictures of Pontius Pilate from our two very different sources. The biblical sources present Pontius Pilate as an innocent Roman working hard to determine if Jesus is guilty or not, but the fear of a mob and the potential to be impeached would have sent his career and Roman social status down the tubes in a hurry, and this was too much for him, and he decided to have Jesus crucified. But even still, the gospel writers go out of their way to tell us that Pilate was innocent of Jesus' blood, and it was the Jews that we are to blame for the killing of Jesus. This is not the picture of Pontius Pilate we get from the non-biblical sources. To Josephus and Philo, Pontius Pilate is nothing short of a monstrous murderer, wicked in all of his ways. I really wish we had a detailed Roman description of Pontius Pilate's life, because the two sources we have now are extremely biased. As I mentioned earlier, the Christians had a reason to present Pontius Pilate in a good and positive light, but Josephus and Philo had all the reasons in the world to present Pontius Pilate as bad and evil. The Jews believed that Israel was their land, given to them through Moses by God. And both Josephus and Philo were Jews. And in the Old Testament, whenever Israel was ruled by a foreign power like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, or the Persians, it was a sign that God was cursing them, that God was far from them because of their sins. The dream that Jews had for the Messiah was that the Messiah would come and free the Jews from foreign rule and reinstate Israel as an independent, sovereign nation, and that this good Messiah would be a warrior king and perhaps even a priest king that would rule Israel with justice and adherence to the mitzvot and the Mosaic law. This is why Josephus and Philo are also biased sources. They have their own theological agenda that they're trying to push, and any Jew living in that time period would, because any Jew living during this time period would believe that any foreign ruler is the bad guy. So who was the real historical Pontius Pilate? Well, to answer this question, we have to look behind the veil of our biased sources and look at Pontius Pilate from all angles in order to make our decision. Historically, within the 1st century, we have 3 different pictures of Pontius Pilate. We have the innocent Pilate who unwillingly put Jesus to death, and this is given to us by the biblical writers. Then, by Josephus and Philo, we have the awful, corrupt, murderous Pontius Pilate. And then we have the Roman Pontius Pilate, who's very boring and underwhelming, who was one of many Roman prefects of Judea, serving Rome in a position of relatively low prestige. We know nothing about his actual death or when he died, but if the assumption that he died shortly after returning to Rome in 36 CE is correct, then he only lived to be 48 years old. Although the idea that he died shortly after returning to Rome is technically an argument from silence, because there are no sources that tell us that this is what happened. So this isn't necessarily the case. He might have just settled back into public life out of the political landscape. And this would also explain why we hear nothing else about him after he returned to Rome. So that's the life of the historical Pontius Pilate. And that's really all we know, at least for now, unless archaeology uncovers more sources about him. Pontius Pilate lives on in the memories of the early Christians, but as time went on, the historical facts about him gave way to fantastic myths and legends about him. And it's within these stories that we get some of the most interesting and some of the most controversial stories about him. Early Christians weren't historians writing history about Pontius Pilate, they were Christians writing theology about him. Let's talk about some of the wildest and craziest things about Pontius Pilate that we learn from later Christian tradition. The first is found in the Gospel of Nicodemus, and I actually mentioned the Gospel of Nicodemus earlier because it mentions the name of Pontius Pilate's wife. The Gospel of Nicodemus is written from the perspective of Nicodemus, a Pharisee, who encountered Jesus in the Gospel of John. This Gospel tells us that Roman officials bowed to Jesus as he was led to trial by the Jews, and that Pilate was exceedingly angry at the Jewish authorities for forcing him to crucify an innocent man. So this story more or less coincides with what we get in the canonical Gospels. Pontius Pilate is innocent. But in the Gospel of Nicodemus, this is heightened by saying that he was overwhelmingly angry at the Jews for forcing him to crucify a righteous and just man. So the Gospel of Nicodemus, very much so, thinks Pilate was innocent. And this is even strengthened more in the Gospel of Peter. In the Gospel of Peter, Pontius Pilate didn't even sentence Jesus to crucifixion. It was Herod. Herod and the Jews didn't wash their hands, but Pilate did. The Gospel of Peter really tells you that Pilate was innocent by not even saying that he ordered Jesus to be crucified. Then there is the letter of Herod to Pilate and the letter of Pilate to Herod, written around the 3rd to 4th century. Obviously not written by the historical Pontius Pilate or Herod. This work tells us that Pilate expressed remorse over executing Jesus, and that he and his wife Procla and the centurion who pierced Jesus' side after his crucifixion, here named Longinus, all converted to Christianity. Even St. Augustine and Eusebius hail Pontius Pilate as a Christian convert. Pontius Pilate is venerated as a saint in Greek Orthodox, Coptic, and the Ethiopian Church. His saintly feast day is on June 25th. Eastern Christian traditions focused on Pilate as a Christian convert and saint, but Western Christian traditions didn't quite have that perception of Pilate. There is a pretty sketchy text of an unknown date written by an unknown author titled Death of Pilate that recounts that Pontius Pilate went to the Emperor Tiberius in Rome when Tiberius was suffering from an awful illness. Tiberius had high hopes that Jesus would heal him, but when he found out that Pilate ordered that Jesus be crucified, Tiberius was furious with Pilate. But when Pilate got to Rome, he brought with him the seamless tunic of Jesus, and that tunic caused Tiberius to not be angry with him anymore, until Pilate was stripped of Jesus' tunic. Then Tiberius got angry with Pilate again, and sentenced him to death in the most disgraceful way. When Pilate heard this, he killed himself with his own knife. This story shows how in the West, Pilate was viewed as one who should suffer and die because of his decision to crucify Jesus. He wasn't nearly as innocent, but he bared some sense of responsibility for Jesus' death. Pilate was indeed a controversial figure in early Christianity, whose public persona changed depending on where and when you look. The picture of Pilate in antiquity was different from the picture of Pilate in the Middle Ages, and different from the picture of Pilate Christians have of him today. To bring this 3-part video series to a close, we can see that Pontius Pilate likely did exist and serve as a Roman prefect in Judea in the 1st century, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. But once we stray away from this fact, we begin to see the many different faces of Pontius Pilate. So I have to ask, what picture of Pontius Pilate do you think is the correct one? Is it the biblical Christian one? Is it the non-biblical Jewish one? Or is it the very incomplete Roman one? And what about the Eastern or Western picture? Did he convert to Christianity or not? Did he die a quiet life in Rome, or did he commit suicide because of his guilt and shame? Or perhaps is the historical truth somewhere in between all 3 accounts? Either way, let me know what you think. And thank you for watching. If you liked this video, consider hitting that like button, or smashing the like button as all the cool kids say, and consider subscribing to this channel for more religious and historical content. And as always, stay thirsty for knowledge, my friends.